Suspenseful music fades in. Jonathan Carter, a retired black FBI director, stands motionless beside his silver sedan, its driver's side door flung open, tires kicking up dust in the Texas desert night. His hands are raised, fingers steady, despite the blood trickling down his temple where a baton split his skin. Two white officers, Victor Hensley and Pete Rollins, stand before him, guns drawn, their flashlights blinding, their shouts mixing with the hum of the wind. But Jonathan's voice cuts through, calm yet unshakable, "You're digging your own graves." Hensley's face twists with contempt as he grips his pistol, a slur dripping from his lips, while Rollins hesitates, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Then, headlights flare in the distance, salvation or doom. Just 12 hours ago, Jonathan was driving home a free man. Now, this night will reshape his future forever. What led to this moment? BUP Stories invites you to find out. Hit like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from if you stand for justice. Pause, tense beat. Jonathan Carter drove down Highway 80, the vast Texas desert stretching endlessly on either side, the heat of the day still lingering in the air. At 65, he had seen more than his fair share of long drives, but tonight, all he wanted was to get home. Retirement had been an adjustment after 40 years in the FBI, but he had earned his peace. The quiet hum of jazz played softly in his silver sedan, a welcome contrast to the chaos that had defined most of his life. He had spent the weekend visiting his sister in El Paso, and now, after a long dinner filled with laughter and memories, he was ready to enjoy the solitude of the open road. The thought of sinking into his favorite chair with a glass of bourbon and watching the stars from his back porch made him press just a little firmer on the gas pedal. Then, the flash of red and blue in his rearview mirror shattered that peace, no sirens, just the sudden pulse of light stabbing through the darkness. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He had been meticulous, his speed steady, his paperwork in order. He knew this wasn't a routine stop. He had been a black man in America long enough to recognize when something was about to go sideways. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch of tires on loose stone unnervingly loud in the stillness. Killing the engine, he placed both hands on the steering wheel, fingers spread, his breathing slow and measured. He had spent decades training agents how to handle high-pressure situations. Now, he was reminding himself to follow the same rules: stay calm, stay controlled, survive. Intriguing music rises. The officer approached with an air of authority too exaggerated to be anything but hostile. The nameplate on his uniform read Hensley, tall, wiry, with a sunburned face and eyes that glinted with something ugly. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Jonathan had dealt with men like him before, the kind who let power curdle into entitlement, who saw a badge as a free pass to unleash whatever demons lurked beneath the surface. License and registration, boy, the last word landed like a slap, deliberate and laced with malice. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, keeping his expression unreadable. He had stared down cartel leaders, corrupt senators, murderers with nothing to lose. He wasn't about to let a small-town officer shake him. "Officer, may I ask why I've been stopped?" His voice was steady, the weight of decades of authority behind it. Hensley smirked, not bothering to answer, as he snatched the license from Jonathan's outstretched hand and tossed it onto the dirt at his feet. "FBI, huh? That's supposed to mean something to me." His voice dripped with mockery as he leaned in, his breath thick with chewing tobacco. Jonathan didn't flinch, though his muscles tensed. He had seen this play out before and knew what came next. Before he could respond, another set of headlights cut through the night, another cruiser pulling up beside them. A second officer stepped out, shorter, stockier, with a buzz cut that accentuated his thick neck. "Rollins, reinforcements not for protection but for escalation." "Got a problem here, Vic?" Rollins asked, his voice casually, almost amused. "Not for long," Hensley muttered, his smirk widening. He shifted his stance slightly, and that's when Jonathan saw it, the slight twitch of his fingers near the baton on his belt. Years of experience had trained Jonathan to read people, to predict their moves before they made them. He had a second, maybe less, before the situation turned violent. The first strike came faster than he expected. The baton cracked against his jaw, white-hot pain exploding through his skull. The second came before he could brace himself, slamming into his ribs with a force that stole his breath. He staggered, gripping the edge of the car for support, his mind flashing through 1,000 scenarios, all of them leading to one conclusion: this was never about a traffic stop. A sharp yank on his wrist sent another jolt of pain through him as cold steel snapped around his wrists, handcuffs tight, too tight, biting into his skin. Resisting arrest, Hensley chuckled, his voice dripping with amusement as he pushed Jonathan toward the squad car. Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears, not from fear but from cold, simmering fury. He had been in handcuffs before, undercover operations, staged arrests, but never like this, never as the victim. He stumbled slightly, feeling blood trickle from the cut on his temple, his vision blurring at the edges. This was wrong, he hadn't done anything, and yet none of that mattered. As Rollins shoved him into the backseat of the cruiser, Jonathan's fingers brushed against the inside pocket of his jacket. He barely moved, just enough to press against a small, discreet button sewn into the lining, a signal, a silent distress call sent directly to the FBI. Hensley and Rollins had no idea who they had just put in cuffs, but they were about to find out. Jonathan sat in the back of the cruiser, his wrists aching from the too tight cuffs, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth where Hensley's baton had cracked against his jaw. The Texas night outside the window was still and endless, the only movement the occasional flicker of desert brush under the glow of the cruiser's tail lights. He breathed steadily, ignoring the pain, his mind working through every possible next step. He had sent the distress signal, now it was only a matter of time. Hensley and Rollins sat in the front, their voices low but audible. "You sure about this, Vic?" Rollins muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "The guy's old, but if he really is FBI." Hensley scoffed, "So what? You think they're going to move heaven and earth for some washed-up Fed? By the time anyone gives a damn, we'll have the story set." He glanced back at Jonathan through the rearview mirror, his smirk returning. "Besides, who's going to believe him? Ex-cop goes rogue, gets violent with local officers. Hell, I'll make sure they find a nice little bag of something in his car by the time we're done." Jonathan remained silent, his heartbeat steady. He had seen men like Hensley his entire life, officers who believed they were untouchable, who thought the badge gave them power over life and death. But there was one thing Hensley had miscalculated: Jonathan Carter wasn't just another victim. A low rumble cut through the silence. It started faint, almost imperceptible, then grew into the unmistakable sound of rotor blades slicing through the night. The hum of approaching SUVs followed, engines roaring like a storm rolling in. Hensley's expression flickered for the first time. "What the hell?" Before he could finish, bright white floodlights illuminated the cruiser, blinding in their intensity. A loudspeaker crackled to life, "Step away from the vehicle, hands where we can see them." Rollins swore under his breath, his hands instinctively moving toward his holster, but Hensley grabbed his arm. "Don't be an idiot," he hissed, his face tight as he squinted into the lights. He knew, they both knew. The doors of several black SUVs swung open in unison, and within seconds, a team of FBI agents emerged, weapons trained. The lead agent, a tall, sharp-featured woman in a dark tactical vest, stepped forward. "Victor Hensley, Pete Rollins," she said, voice clipped, "you're both under investigation for unlawful detainment and excessive use of force." Hensley snapped, though his bravado was cracking, he resisted. "We have footage," the agent interrupted coolly, "your body cams, your dash cams, all of it." She nodded toward the cruiser. "Step out now." For a moment, it looked like Hensley might argue, but the weight of the situation settled over him like a crushing force. Slowly, he and Rollins stepped out of the vehicle, hands raised. Jonathan exhaled as the back door was yanked open, his restraints unlocked within seconds. "You okay, sir?" The agent studied his face, noting the bruises and the cut on his temple. "I'll live," Jonathan muttered, rubbing his wrists. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, locking eyes with Hensley. "You picked the wrong man to mess with." Hensley glared, his mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. He had lost, he knew it. But Jonathan also knew men like him didn't go down quietly. Urgent music intensifies. The media explosion was immediate: a retired FBI director brutally assaulted and unlawfully detained by corrupt officers. The headlines wrote themselves. Within days, the incident sparked protests outside the El Paso precinct. News anchors dissected the footage, legal analysts debated the charges. Hensley and Rollins were suspended, then formally charged with assault and falsification of reports. The weight of federal scrutiny bore down on them, forcing the entire precinct into an internal investigation. Jonathan, however, knew this was far from over. 3 nights after the arrest, his phone rang. He recognized the number before he even answered. Carter, Director Carter, the voice belonged to an old friend, Deputy Director Andrew Hayes. You're officially the biggest headache in Texas right now. Jonathan exhaled a quiet laugh. That bad? Worse, Hayes replied. Hensley and Rollins weren't just bad apples, they were part of something bigger. A pause. El Paso's entire law enforcement structure is compromised. There's a network of officers protecting each other, burying misconduct, pushing drugs, running protection rackets, and it doesn't stop at the precinct. It goes all the way up. Jonathan didn't have to ask. Clyde Warren? Bingo, Hayes said. Warren's been untouchable for years. He owns judges, prosecutors, city officials. But this case, it's shaking the foundation. The feds are watching now, and that makes you a problem. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. They're coming for me already, are they? Hayes' voice turned grim. They're going to hit you where it hurts. Jonathan should have expected it. He should have known that men like Warren never let things go quietly. The break-in happened just before dawn. His home, his sanctuary, the place he had built after a lifetime of chasing justice, was ransacked, drawers overturned, bookshelves gutted, furniture ripped apart. But it wasn't the destruction that made his blood run cold, it was the evidence: 2 plastic bags of cocaine carefully placed in his bedroom closet. Jonathan stood in the wreckage, his fists clenching, as he heard his wife's voice tremble behind him. Jonathan? Lena whispered, her fingers tightening around their 12-year-old son's shoulders. They planted it, didn't they? He turned, taking in the fear in Jamal's wide eyes, the way Lena stood protectively in front of their son. Yeah, he said, his voice low, they did. Before he could say anything else, flashing red and blue lights filled the windows. The knock on the door was sharp, deliberate. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Lena, then inhaled deeply, straightening his spine. Stay with Jamal, he murmured, no matter what. He opened the door to find 4 uniformed officers standing on his porch. The lead officer, a square-jawed man with a cold expression, held up a warrant. Jonathan Carter, he said, you're under arrest. Jonathan didn't move. He could hear Jamal behind him, breathing fast, trying to be brave. They found drugs, Daddy, Jamal whispered. They're saying you. Jonathan turned sharply, his voice firm but gentle. I know, it's a lie. Then, to the officers, you know damn well I didn't put that there. The lead officer didn't blink. Tell it to the judge. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists for the second time in a week, Jonathan felt something deeper than anger: resolve. They wanted him buried, they had just made their biggest mistake yet. Jonathan Carter sat in the back of the police cruiser, his wrists bound in cold steel for the second time in a week. The difference this time was the weight of the setup, the fabricated evidence, the blatant warning from Clyde Warren's network that he was in over his head. He had spent a lifetime unraveling corruption, and now corruption was trying to unravel him. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights reflected off his home, illuminating his wife, Lena, and their son, Jamal, standing frozen in the doorway, Lena's arms wrapped tightly around Jamal, her face pale, her eyes locked onto Jonathan's through the windshield. Jonathan could see the fear in her gaze, fear not just for him but for their son, for what this could mean if the system turned against them. The cruiser pulled away, rolling into the quiet streets of their suburban neighborhood, the distant sound of dogs barking and the early morning rustle of wind the only noise in the air. He kept his face expressionless, his body still, conserving his energy. He had been in the FBI for 40 years, he had seen powerful men fall, watched the guilty believe themselves untouchable until the moment the cuffs locked around their wrists. But he also knew how the game was played. Warren wasn't just trying to intimidate him, he was trying to erase him. The drive to the station was longer than necessary. It wasn't about distance, it was about sending a message. The officer driving, a young man in his late 20s, kept glancing at Jonathan through the rearview mirror, as if expecting him to speak, to plead, to react. Jonathan didn't give him the satisfaction. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best weapon. When they arrived at the precinct, the air inside was thick with tension. Jonathan could feel the eyes of the officers on him, some curious, some amused, others indifferent. A few exchanged knowing glances, like they had seen this play out before. A black man in cuffs, an easy case. Except this wasn't just anyone. A uniformed officer led him to a booking desk, the fluorescent lights above casting harsh shadows across the cracked tile floors. The officer behind the desk barely looked up as he began the routine intake. Name? Jonathan didn't answer, he simply stared. The officer sighed. Name? Jonathan Carter. The officer's hand paused midair. The name meant something to him, but he quickly recovered, pretending as if it didn't. He continued typing. Charges, possession with intent to distribute. Jonathan let out a quiet laugh. That's creative. The officer ignored him. Another officer, a burly man with a graying mustache, grabbed Jonathan's elbow roughly. Let's go. They led him to a holding cell, a small, windowless space with a metal bench bolted to the wall. The heavy iron door clanked shut behind him. Jonathan leaned back against the cool cinder block wall, closing his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had two choices: wait and let the system play its game, or take control. The answer was clear. He opened his eyes, adjusting to the dim light, then slowly reached into his sleeve, where, before leaving the house, he had discreetly slipped his watch's emergency transmitter into the lining of his shirt. One press, the signal went out. Now it was only a matter of time. The wait wasn't long. 2 hours later, the door to his cell swung open. A tall man in a dark suit stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Deputy Director Andrew Hayes. Jonathan smirked. Took you long enough? Hayes stepped forward, his voice low. Jesus, Carter, they really don't want you breathing, do they? Jonathan stood, rolling his shoulders, testing the soreness in his ribs. It's Warren. Hayes nodded. We know. He reached into his pocket and handed Jonathan a neatly folded piece of paper. A warrant, federal jurisdiction override. You're out. The officer who had arrested him stood nearby, watching, his face unreadable but his fists clenched. Jonathan met his gaze as he walked past, unbothered. Once outside, the morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden streaks across the city. Hayes led him to an unmarked black SUV, shutting the door behind him. Jonathan exhaled. What do we have? Hayes started the engine, pulling away from the precinct. Enough to make Warren sweat, but not enough to bring him down. He shot Jonathan a look. Yet. Jonathan nodded. Then we need to hit harder. They didn't go to his home, that wasn't safe anymore. Instead, Hayes drove them to a secure facility on the outskirts of the city, an off-the-books safe house where intelligence operations often ran from the shadows. Inside, a team of analysts, field agents, and legal experts were already in motion. A young analyst named Malik briefed him. We've been digging into Warren's network. The planted drugs, classic move, but there's something bigger. Jonathan leaned in. Go on. Malik tapped on his keyboard, pulling up a surveillance feed. There's a financial trail: offshore accounts, dummy corporations, bribes, and, more importantly, people he's paid off. The screen changed, showing a list of names: judges, district attorneys, police chiefs. Jonathan's eyes darkened. This isn't just corruption, it's a full-blown criminal enterprise. Hayes crossed his arms. And Warren at the top. Jonathan nodded, his mind already working through the angles. Then we cut the head off the snake. Hayes hesitated. Carter, this is dangerous. We're talking about a man who spent decades burying enemies. He's already come after you once. Jonathan's voice was calm. Then we make sure he never does again. The next 48 hours moved fast. The team worked non-stop, compiling evidence, tracing transactions, flipping lower-level operatives. The goal wasn't just to expose Warren, it was to dismantle everything he had built. By the time the case was airtight, Jonathan sat at a table across from an assistant U.S. attorney, reviewing the final steps. You understand, the attorney said, adjusting his glasses, once this goes public, there's no turning back. Jonathan's expression was steel. That's the point. And so, the operation began. It started with an arrest, not Warren, not yet first, it was his most trusted officers, the ones who had planted the drugs, the ones who had orchestrated years of cover-ups. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, Warren's allies were panicking, distancing themselves, cutting deals. Then, the real blow, a federal indictment, a press conference. The footage played across every major news channel, Jonathan Carter standing alongside federal prosecutors, laying out the charges against Clyde Warren: money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy. Within the day, Warren was taken into custody. Jonathan watched the live broadcast as officers led Warren in cuffs through the doors of the courthouse. The once untouchable man looked furious, his face twisted in barely controlled rage. Jonathan knew he would fight, would use his resources, his connections, try to worm his way out. But for the first time in years, the system was working against him. And Jonathan Carter had won. The night was quiet when he finally returned home. Lena stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Jamal peeked from behind her. Jonathan exhaled. It's over. Lena studied him. Is it? He looked past her at their son, at the house they had built, at the life he had almost lost. Then he nodded. For us, it is. BUP Stories. Stay tuned for more gripping stories.